There's a famous thought experiment about a runaway train. It's going to run over 100 people tied to the track ahead of it. You're standing next to a lever. Pull it. The train switches to a different track, where it kills one person instead of 100. Do you pull it? Is 100 lives saved worth the cost of one life lost? During the An Lushan Rebellion, the Tang Dynasty general Zhang Xun was faced with a similar dilemma. In the year 757, it was the second year of the An Lushan Rebellion, and the Tang Dynasty was fighting for its life. The rebel armies held the north. They had taken both capitals, and they were marching south, toward the rice fields and tax offices of the Linhuai basin. But one city stood in their way, the city of Suiyang. And the defenders of Suiyang did everything they could in order to hold the city, including the cannibalization of over 20,000 civilians. Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Today, I will tell the story of the infamous siege of Suiyang. Let's start with why did Suiyang matter so much? The city guarded the water route that carried the grain and coins of Jianghuai to the north. This meant that whoever controlled Suiyang would have access to the resources of the south. If the city fell to the rebel forces, then that could lead to the end of the Tang Dynasty. And the rebel forces couldn't just go around the city, because that would be leaving an enemy garrison right on their supply line if they were to continue pushing south. So the rebel forces led by the general Ying Ziqi laid siege to Suiyang. And the man who commanded the defense of the city was the general Zhang Xun. But he was not supposed to be a general at all. Before the rebellion, Zhang Xun was the magistrate of Zhenyuan. He was a civil officer who governed a county, not to lead an army. When the rebellion began, Zhang Xun gathered the local volunteers and organized them into a fighting force to defend the region. But as the rebel armies pushed across northern China, he was forced to retreat south until he finally reached Suiyang, where he joined forces with the city's governor, Xu. They couldn't retreat anymore because they knew that they had to hold the city. The main imperial army, led by General Guo Ziyi, was fighting to the west and the north, focused on taking back the capital, Chang'an, and was too far away to help. So, for nearly 10 months, the forces at Suiyang stood their ground. They held back the rebel army, a force many times their size, with no enforcements and no supplies. On February 18th, Zhang Xun reached Suiyang with 3,000 men, adding to the few thousand who were already defending the city. They now had a combined defense of around 6,800 soldiers, for a city of a little over 50,000 civilians. While Xu was the governor of Suiyang, he gave full military command of the soldiers and defense to Zhang Xun, focusing his attention on administration and supplies of the city instead. This was because Xu had no experience as a military commander, and Zhang Xun had already spent almost a year leading battles against the rebel forces. Even though Zhang Xun was originally a civil officer, he was a formidable man, over 2 meters tall, with a wild beard. And he was also a brilliant man, with a remarkable memory. He could remember the contents of any book that he had read. He could even compose essays straight from memory without mistakes. And that memory was not just for literature. He knew the name and face of every soldier under his command. These qualities made Zhang Xun an exceptional military commander, because he could quickly read the battlefield and adapt to changing situations. The rebel general Ying Ziqi arrived at Suiyang that same day, with a force of 130,000 soldiers. The rebel forces immediately surrounded the city, and the siege began. And once the fighting started, it did not stop for 16 days. Some days saw as many as 20 skirmishes. Zhang Xun did not command the defense from safety behind the city walls. Instead, he fought on the walls with the soldiers and personally led multiple counterattacks against the enemy. When the fighting finally paused, the ground outside Suiyang was covered with the bodies of over 20,000 fallen rebels. Their horses, weapons, and armor were taken back behind the city walls, Every small victory was not just about how many enemies were killed, but also about how much longer it allowed the city to keep fighting. Outside the walls, Ying Ziqi pulled his army back to regroup. The siege of Suiyang had just begun. But even after their first victory, the situation was still desperate. They were still greatly outnumbered, and not everyone inside the city had the same determination to fight until the end. Not long after the first battle, one of Governor Xu Yuan's own officers, a man named Tian Xiurong, started secretly communicating with the rebels. Zhang Xun quickly found out and executed Tian Xiurong on the city walls, in front of all of the defending soldiers. Zhang Xun needed every soldier to understand one thing, that there would be no surrender. They were going to defend the city or die trying. But then, Xu Yuan raised the most important issue of all, the city's food supply. Before the siege began, Suiyang had been prepared for long defense. Xu Yuan had stored enough grain to feed the city for over a year. But then, as the rebel forces closed in, half of the grain held at Suiyang was ordered to be sent to two neighboring commanderies, Puyang and Jiying. The reasoning was that if Puyang and Jiying held, then the rebel forces might not even reach Suiyang at all. By supporting those commanderies, they could stop the rebellion before it reached the city. Governor Xu Yuan argued against the order as strongly as he could, but he could not stop it. And sadly, the transfer of grain ended in disaster. To everyone's shock, Jiying quickly surrendered to the rebel forces, not only clearing the way toward Suiyang, but handing over all of their supplies as well. And now, Suiyang was under siege, with no end in sight. And they had less than 6 months of food remaining. For about 2 months, Ying Ziqi's rebel army camped outside Suiyang, surrounding the city, but not attacking. During this time, another 20,000 rebels arrived to reinforce the siege. And then, it was the end of May. The wheat in the fields outside Suiyang had ripened, and the rebels began harvesting it for themselves. With food becoming a growing concern, Zhang Xun needed to get as much of that wheat into the city as he could, or at least deny as much of it as possible to the enemy. But he couldn't simply ride out against an army 20 times his size to harvest it. So he came up with another plan. That night, he had his soldiers beat the war drums inside the city, as if they were about to charge out through the gates. The rebels heard the drums and scrambled into formation to meet the attack. They held their position through the night, but no attack came. The next night, Zhang Xun did it again, and again the night after that. After several nights of false alarms, the rebel commanders decided that Zhang Xun was simply trying to keep them from sleeping. So they stopped responding to the drums from the city. But that was exactly what Zhang Xun was waiting for. His men rode out at dawn into an unprepared rebel camp, attacking before the rebels could properly organize. And if they could find and kill the enemy general Ying Ziqi during the chaos, then they might even be able to immediately break the siege on the city. The surprise attack drew Ying Ziqi out into the open, giving Zhang Xun the opening he had been waiting for. They finally had a clear shot at the rebel general, and they took it, landing an arrow in his left eye. But unfortunately, Ying Ziqi survived. They almost captured him, but there were just too many rebel soldiers. Ying Ziqi was quickly covered by his guards and pulled to safety. With the rebel soldiers finally organizing, Zhang Xun's men withdrew back behind the city walls. It was a small victory, but now Ying Ziqi was angry. Ying Ziqi decided to force his way into the city. The rebel army built large ladders and siege engines to carry soldiers over the walls. He used special machines meant to tear down the defense towers of the city. He used battering rams to try to break down the city gates. But Zhang Xun was ready for all of it. The defending soldiers dropped burning coals on the enemy ladders and poured hot oil and molten metal onto the battering rams. The siege machines were not working, so Ying Ziqi changed the plan. His men piled earth and timber against the northwest corner, where the ground already sat slightly higher than the rest of the city, building a ramp toward the top of the walls, and Zhang Xun led them. Then, on a day the wind was blowing toward the rebel camp, Zhang Xun led a surprise attack out through the city gates, and his soldiers made their way to the ramp that the rebels had been building and lit it on fire. It burned for more than 20 days before it finally went out, and Ying Ziqi was forced to pull his army back. It was another victory for the defenders of Suiyang, and the city still stood, but their food was running out. It was now July. Outside the walls, every day Suiyang still stood was another day the rebel armies remained trapped here instead of advancing toward Jianghuai. The rebel army had been reinforced again by additional tens of thousands of soldiers, and Ying Ziqi tightened the encirclement around Suiyang. Since he had not been able to take the city by force so far, this time he was going to take it slow. He decided he was just going to starve the city out. The rebel army had the city completely surrounded. They couldn't get into the city, but there was also no way out. Rations within the city had fallen to a single spoonful of rice per soldier per day. By the end of the month, the grain was gone completely. Men were eating tree bark and paper, anything that they could eat. Close to 1,000 fell sick from hunger alone, too weak to draw a bow. The defending soldiers had to bind their own wounds and return immediately to their position on the city walls. But Zhang Xun had not given up. It is said that Zhang Xun had a plan that could save the city, but he needed to coordinate his plan with imperial forces on the outside. But there was no way for him to get his message out. By August, only 1,600 defending soldiers remained capable of fighting. By the end of August, only 600 defending soldiers remained. By now, the bark and paper were gone too. There was nothing left in Suiyang that could be eaten. Well, except for the horses. They had tried their best to take care of their horses because they still needed them for battle. But it was too late to worry about that now. The horses were slaughtered and eaten, and that kept them going for a few more weeks, until most of the horses were gone too. After the horses, it was the birds and the rats. Men went looking for them in every corner of the city until there were none left inside the walls to catch. After that, the leather, armor straps, bowstrings, the leather ties holding equipment together, all of it cut down, boiled for hours, and eaten, but it still wasn't enough. The siege was still not broken, and the rebel army was still there. I cannot possibly imagine what Zhang Xun and the other defenders were thinking or feeling during this time. Despair? Hopelessness? But what we do know is that Zhang Xun refused to give up. Zhang Xun gathered the soldiers who were still strong enough to stand and brought his own concubine out in front of all of them. And he said, "All of you have given everything to hold the city for our country. We have fought together this entire time with almost nothing to eat, and your loyalty has never once wavered. I cannot cut flesh from my own body to feed you, but how can I spare the life of one woman while I watch all of you starve?" And then he killed her, right there in front of the soldiers. The soldiers wept. They refused to eat her. She was a person. But Zhang Xun ordered them to eat. If they didn't eat, they would starve. Governor Xu watched what Zhang Xun had done and then did the same with servants from his own household. But this was not a long-term strategy. If no reinforcements came, and with no food, they could not defend for much longer. So Zhang Xun turned to his most trusted officer, Nan Jiyun. With only 30 riders on their remaining horses, he was sent on what was almost certainly a suicide mission. His task was simple: break through the siege and bring back help. The rebel general Ying Ziqi was confident that Suiyang would fall any day now, and his army began to let its guard down. I mean, there weren't even 600 soldiers left defending the city. What could they possibly do? And that was how Nan Jiyun's 30 riders caught the rebels completely by surprise. And by some miracle, they broke through the siege. Now they just needed to find help. Nan Jiyun headed southwest first, towards Qiaozhou, where he met with Commander Xu Shuji. But Xu Shuji was not willing to send soldiers and offered bolts of silk instead. What was Nan Jiyun supposed to do with bolts of silk? He was enraged, but there was nothing he could do, and he had no time to waste. So he left and headed for his next option, Linhuai, to the southeast. And there he met with Commander Helan Jingming, who was the military governor of the entire Henan region. A part of him was expecting to be met with rejection again, but he was desperate. And to his surprise, he was welcomed with a lavish banquet. Helan Jingming had prepared a luxurious banquet and invited Nan Jiyun to sit and eat. After weeks of near starvation, a feast like this was almost unimaginable. But it turned out that Helan Jingming was not interested in reinforcing Suiyang at all. Instead, he was just trying to recruit Nan Jiyun into his own forces. Helan Jingming admired Nan Jiyun's courage, especially after learning he had broken out of the besieged Suiyang. When Nan Jiyun realized why he had been invited, he was shocked. He immediately stood up and cried. When I left Suiyang, its people had not eaten in over a month. Even if I wanted to sit here and feast by myself, my conscience wouldn't let me. And even if I tried to eat, I couldn't possibly swallow a single bite. Then he drew his own knife and cut off one of his fingers. Blood ran down his hand in front of the entire room. He told Helan Jingming he was leaving the finger behind as proof that he had come, since he had nothing else left to bring back to his commander. The whole room went silent, and some officers cried. But it didn't matter. Helan Jingming did not waver and refused to send soldiers to Suiyang. Before Nan Jiyun left the city, he stopped at a Buddhist pagoda and fired an arrow into it, burying the arrow shaft halfway into the wall, and promised, "When I return after destroying the rebels, I will kill Helan Jingming. This arrow is my vow." But Nan Jiyun would never be able to return to fulfill that promise. Nan Jiyun did not return to Suiyang with nothing. At Zhenyuan County, a local official gave him 100 horses. At Ningning County, the garrison commander there gave him 3,000 soldiers, which was the first real reinforcement Suiyang had seen since the siege began. One night, a heavy fog had settled over the city, and Nan Jiyun tried to use the fog as cover to slip past the rebel lines in the dark. But it didn't work. It wasn't easy to hide a column of 3,000 soldiers, even under the fog. The rebels spotted them and gathered to stop them. The sneaking turned into a dash, which turned into a running fight toward the city walls. Most of them did not make it through, with only about 1,000 soldiers reaching the city. And as Nan Jiyun approached the city walls, he began to shout as loud as he could. Zhang Xun heard the fighting outside the walls and recognized Nan Jiyun's voice. He immediately ordered the city gates opened so that Nan Jiyun and his men could get inside. Nan Jiyun and his men barely made it, but they had managed to drive several hundred head of cattle from the rebel camp into the city with them. It was food that the city desperately needed. After hearing Nan Jiyun's report, everyone finally understood what this meant, that this was it. No more reinforcements would be coming. what Nan Jiyun had brought back was nowhere near enough to save the city. It was just 1,000 more soldiers to die with them. The morale of the defenders plummeted. Many of them wanted to abandon the city and try to break out of the rebel army while they still had a chance. But Zhang Xun and Suiyang refused. For them, abandoning the city had never been an option. Even if reinforcements were not coming, they still had to defend Suiyang in order to protect the southern regions and the resources of Jianghuai. And they didn't have enough horses to get all of the soldiers out anyways. So they stayed. But at least Nan Jiyun had brought back some cattle, and that would be able to sustain them for a little while longer. But not for too long. By late September, the cattle were gone, and then there was literally nothing left in Suiyang that could pretend to be food, except for the people still living in it. It was not an easy decision to make, but was there really a choice for them? They started with the women first, and then it was the elderly, and then they turned to the remaining young and children. By late November, there were only around 400 people left in the city. Everyone else in the city had either died or had been eaten. It is said that between 20,000 and 30,000 civilians were eaten. It had cost them everything to keep the city standing, but reinforcements still did not come. The soldiers that were left could barely stand. They could barely lift a weapon. They could no longer defend the city, even if they wanted to. Was it all worth it? On November 24th, Ying Ziqi attacked the city one final time. There was nobody left to stop him this time. As Suiyang was about to fall, Zhang Xun turned to face west and bowed. He cried out, "My wisdom and courage are exhausted. I could not drive back the enemy, and I could not hold the city. But even in death, I swear that I will return as a vengeful ghost to haunt these rebels forever, to repay the grace of your majesty." And finally, after 9 long months, the city of Suiyang fell to the rebel army. Zhang Xun, Suiyang, Nan Jiyun, and the surviving soldiers were captured and bound. Even at this moment, Zhang Xun refused to bow to the enemy. He remained calm and chose to meet his fate head on. He stood and said to the others, "Do not be afraid. Death is only fate." Ying Ziqi was impressed by Zhang Xun's bravery and resolve. Even now, Zhang Xun showed no fear. Ying Ziqi wondered if Zhang Xun would be willing to surrender, to serve him instead. But his officers told him that that would be impossible. If Zhang Xun was ever going to defect, he would have surrendered long ago. So he turned to Nan Jiyun instead and told him he could still live if he was willing to surrender. But Nan Jiyun said nothing. And Zhang Xun called out to him, "It is just death. A man cannot bend to injustice." Nan Jiyun smiled and replied, "I only stayed alive this long because I hoped I could still be useful. But my Lord has spoken, so how can I be afraid to die?" And then they were executed. But they kept Suiyang alive. They planned to take him to Luoyang and present him to the rebel leadership as proof of their victory. But Suiyang did not survive much longer than the others and was killed while being transported as a prisoner. A newly appointed Tang Dynasty commander named Zhang Hao learned about the situation at Suiyang and marched his own armies there to help. But it was too late. By the time his forces arrived, Suiyang had already been lost for 3 days. Even though Suiyang fell, the efforts of its defenders were not in vain. By holding the city for almost 10 months, they prevented the rebels from advancing into Jianghuai and taking the resources of the south. and they gave the imperial forces the time that it needed to regroup and fight back. By the time Ying Ziqi's army finally took Suiyang, the imperial army had already taken back the capital city of Chang'an, and a few days after the fall of Suiyang, the imperial army took back Luoyang. The tide of war was turning, and the empire was striking back. Now, the defense of Suiyang did not save the Tang Dynasty on its own, but if the city had fallen earlier, the rebels would almost certainly have taken Jianghuai, expanded their armies, and placed the empire in far greater danger. Even then, not everyone believed that Suiyang should have been defended at such a cost. When people learned what had happened inside Suiyang, some condemned Zhang Xun for allowing the defenders to eat the people they were supposed to protect. Others called him a fool for continuing to hold the city when there was no longer any hope of rescue. To them, nothing could justify what had happened inside those walls. But there were also many who spoke out in defense of Zhang Xun's actions. Without Zhang Xun, Suiyang would have fallen, and without Suiyang, the resources of the south would have been lost. But does saving an empire make everything done in its defense acceptable? This brings us back to the question that was asked in the beginning of the video. Do you pull the lever and kill one person to save 100? Zhang Xun did not have a train or a lever, and his choice was much more complicated. But he did choose to sacrifice the people trapped inside Suiyang in the hopes of saving countless others beyond its walls. At the end of the day, we're left with the tragedy of the siege of Suiyang, and a question that historians and philosophers still argue about today. Was Zhang Xun a hero, or was he a monster? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. That's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.